What happened in France, what is unfolding in France, is the defeat of the centre and the failure of centrist policies. These are exactly the policies which Keir Starmer is going to be elected on.
Yeah.
If he fails in Britain, and don't forget his policies are obsessed with net zero, pretty relaxed about immigration, high taxes, industrial strategy, metropolitan-based.
Andrew Neil just turned Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves into a political punchline, and it's honestly hard to look away. Imagine two politicians walking confidently into a verbal wood chipper. Yeah, it's that brutal. Starmer brought his usual vague charm, Reeves came armed with buzzwords, and Neil, he brought receipts, sarcasm, and a PhD in demolition. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when confidence meets cold, hard logic and loses, stick around. This meltdown is a masterclass in embarrassment.
We will build on.
Starmer, a pledge is not an indication. A pledge is a word, is your word. It's a pledge.
Bit collective
it's
action.
Not in your pledge.
Well, the pledge is 3 lines, Andrew. You're asking me for more detail and I'm giving it to you.
Well, but the fact is the 2016 Trade Union Act, when it comes to cribbing and curtailing union power, is not the key legislation. Because you're hiding behind the process.
No, the Labour Party
Why
said...
don't you do what the other candidates do and tell... Don't Labour members have a right, as they decide whether to vote for you or not, they want to know where your money's coming from?
I've been asked that many times. I've said it's coming from trade unions, from crowdfunding.
When Andrew Neil gets involved, it usually ends with someone's political reputation duct taped back together behind the scenes, while their team Googles how to quietly delete economic promises. And this time, the unlucky contestants were Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, who apparently thought the laws of arithmetic were optional, bless their hearts.
Pretty much consign everything Labour had to say about tax during the election campaign to the dustbin of history. Consider how the narrative has changed. Before the election, we were assured that all Labour spending plans were fully costed and that there was no need for taxes to rise, bar a few small and specific increases like VAT on school fees. Within weeks of being elected, Chancellor Rachel Reeves claimed to have discovered a £22 billion fiscal black hole left behind by the dastardly Tories.
Now, let's talk about Labour's grand unveiling of what they've dubbed a fiscally responsible, visionary roadmap to economic growth. Or, as Andrew Neil would likely classify it, a budgetary hallucination wrapped in PowerPoint clip art. Because if there's anything Reeves and Starmer are good at, it's making ambitious plans that look like they were inspired by a children's colouring book, complete with glitter glue, but without the numbers or cents.
Reeves says the budget was a one-off, that others won't be like this one. But if the OBR's anemic growth forecasts are still too optimistic, she will be back for more tax and more borrowing. But it was a watershed budget. It propels the UK tax burden and public spending as a share of GDP towards European social democratic levels. That was no accident. It was the chosen direction of travel of the Starmer-Reeves project.
The Labour's team marches out this majestic economic blueprint. Big promises, big dreams, big vacuum where the money should be. It was introduced with all the fanfare of a royal wedding, minus the actual ring, or the ability to pay for one. This wasn't just a plan, no. It was the Mona Lisa of economic illusions. And Neil, ever the art critic, pointed out it was more finger painting than fine art.
You can see trouble coming down the pike for Brussels, which is not used to having major European governments that think differently from Brussels. That is undoubtedly a problem. And then even bigger issues of defence. Although the National Rally has kind of toned down its criticism, it's still pretty pro-Russian. It's still not a huge fan of Ukraine. It's still not a huge fan of NATO by any means.
At the core of this plan was the word that Labour tossed around like confetti at a political wedding: fully costed. Yes, that magical phrase that politicians love to say when they don't want anyone looking too closely. Fully costed apparently means you've vaguely gestured in the direction of a spreadsheet while hoping no one asks follow-up questions. Reeves might as well have stamped "do not open" across the entire fiscal forecast and called it transparency. Enter Andrew Neil. quietly sitting in his study, surrounded by actual data and a calculator, staring at Labour's figures like he's been handed a Sudoku puzzle with half the numbers missing. You can almost hear the sigh. You see, Neil doesn't need to yell. He just crunches the numbers and watches as political fantasy evaporates under the crushing weight of logic. What he found? Oh, just that the revenue Labour claims is enough to fund their utopia could maybe at best cover tea and biscuits at the Treasury. Let's talk about that Green Prosperity Plan, the £28 billion sterling, 0p crown jewel of Labour's climate strategy, or more accurately, the ghost of a promise that vanished faster than a manifesto pledge after an election. 1 minute it's front and centre, the next minute it's buried under a pile of excuses about fiscal responsibility. It was the economic version of a Tinder date who said they'd call and then deleted the app.
Details, though the one detail we've got, I think, is a problem for the government, which is it's basically rolling over the existing EU access to British fisheries waters for another 12 years. And I saw earlier you were a bit surprised by that because it's way above the upper end of what Britain was expected to concede. Some talked of 5. They maybe got up to 10. Nobody was talking about 12. So I think the European Union will regard that as a major victory. That's a notch on their lap.
Reeves tried to keep the Green Prosperity Plan alive in a Schrodinger's budget kind of way. It both exists and doesn't exist, depending on whether you're looking at it or trying to fund it. It's bold, visionary and fiscally biodegradable. Labour couldn't decide if they wanted to lead on climate or just nod politely in its general direction while slashing the numbers like a discount sale at the Department of Delusions. Now we arrive at the economic growth fantasy, Labour's secret sauce, the magic wand that's going to make all of this work. Because when you can't afford your plans, just shout growth enough times and maybe the GDP fairy will appear and hand deliver a budget surplus. Neil picked apart this little narrative like a cat with a Christmas tree. The idea that you can build a massive spending strategy based on imaginary future growth is a bit like applying for a mortgage using monopoly money and a dream board. But here's where it gets truly delicious. Labour's plan hinges on stimulating this miraculous growth through investment. Vague investment, ethereal investment, angular investment that's spoken of in the way someone might describe a vacation they can't afford but are manifesting into existence.
Chancellor Reeves woke up this morning to a pretty miserable set of newspaper headlines about her budget. Then she subjected herself to a grueling round of breakfast interviews on TV and radio, during which she was never off the back foot. She was regularly reminded that Labour had promised no major tax rises, yet she had just increased taxes by the biggest amount ever in money terms, at a time when the tax burden on the nation was already at a 70-year high. The bulk of this extra tax comes from a £25 billion rise in national insurance.
And Andrew Neil, with his usual surgical dissection, pointed out the bit Labour skipped over. What exactly are they investing in? How much return are they expecting? And where, precisely, is this money supposed to come from? Ah, yes, the money. That small detail. Labour's self-imposed fiscal rules were supposed to reassure the public that they're not, in fact, planning to set the economy on fire and roast marshmallows over the debt. These rules include the promise to have debt falling at the end of the Parliament. A nice idea until you remember they've promised a spending spree that looks suspiciously like an economic rave. If their plan was a bank loan application, the lender would be pressing the panic button before even finishing the first page. And this is where Neil's cold logic really shines. You can't spend like a drunken sailor and also claim to be tightening the purse strings. Labour's numbers don't bend, they snap. There's simply not enough revenue to cover the promises, not unless the UK suddenly discovers a gold mine under Downing Street or finally taxes hot air from political speeches. And let's not forget the star of the fiscal hypocrisy show, Rachel Reeves herself.
With this, and even admitted that though employers would pay the rise, the cost would eventually be paid for by workers in lower wages and fewer jobs, something listeners to this show will know already. She was forced to concede that despite a vast new public spending spree and a massive increase in borrowing, there would be no sustained rise in economic growth. Indeed, the Office for Budget Responsibility was now projecting a slightly smaller economy by the end of the decade than its projection at the March budget.
The former Bank of England economist who now delivers economic briefings with all the precision of a broken Etch-a-Sketch. Reeves constantly reminds us of her impressive financial credentials, which is helpful because you'd never guess from her economic blueprint. Neil naturally pounced on this contradiction like a cat spotting a laser pointer. If Reeves is such a wizard with numbers, why do her spreadsheets read like wish lists from a unicorn-themed birthday party? The contrast is staggering. Reeves projects confidence, calculated, precise, technocratic confidence. The kind that screams, "Trust me, I've worked in finance." But Neil's analysis exposed the emperor's new clothes. Her economic pitch is dressed up in professional attire, but underneath, it's the same flimsy scaffolding of hopeful guesses and shaky assumptions. Just because you say numbers out loud doesn't mean they add up. And now, the Brexit black hole. Labour's economic plan makes the daring choice to ignore the single largest economic event in a generation, as if Brexit were just a phase the UK went through, like frosted tips or fidget spinners. Reeves and Starmer pretend that the post-Brexit landscape doesn't exist, crafting a budget that could only function in a parallel universe where trade barriers, regulatory divergence, and economic contraction are fiction. Andrew Neil spotted that omission faster than a hawk on espresso. It's not just a gap, it's a canyon.
The bank expects inflation, currently 2.5%, to spike at over 3.7% in the summer, largely thanks to rising energy prices. And it doesn't expect to get back to its inflation target of 2% until the end of 2027. The bank thinks we've avoided a recession, but it's on a knife edge. It thinks the economy shrank by 0.1% in the last 3 months of 2024, but will rise by 0.1% in the first 3 months of 2025.
Trying to plan the UK economy without addressing Brexit is like building a restaurant and forgetting the kitchen. Labour's strategy is to tiptoe around the topic, perhaps hoping the consequences will quietly dissolve if ignored hard enough. Because nothing says fiscal responsibility like pretending a multi-billion-pound economic shift doesn't affect your numbers. Let's take a moment to address taxation, that pesky thing governments do to fund services, and the Labour Party's attempt to perform a miracle, deliver Nordic-style welfare with American-style tax rates. Spoiler alert, this doesn't work. Never has, never will. Unless you're planning to print money until the Queen appears in a puff of smoke and personally cancels inflation. Labour claims they'll raise revenues without raising taxes on the majority. The math once again goes on holiday. Neil calmly deconstructs this illusion by pointing out the obvious. Taxing a few billionaires and non-DOMs isn't going to fund the promised investments, not unless they all suddenly win the Euro millions every week. The plan hinges on making bold promises to everyone and hard decisions to no one. It's a financial tightrope walk with all the danger and none of the skill.
It should have been a breeze for Keir Starmer, the first Labour Prime Minister to address a Labour conference in 15 years, her return to power with a stonking majority, the Tories reduced almost to a rump and mired in yet another interminable leadership contest. But it's far from a breeze. Labour's honeymoon ended before there was even time to pop open the champagne. Labour's already losing ground in the polls. It's already lost its lead in Scotland. And Starmer's personal ratings are tanking.
And let's not overlook the masterclass in vagueness. Labour's policies are crafted with just enough detail to seem tangible, but not enough to be scrutinised. It's political tofu, absorbing whatever flavour is needed, offering no substance of its own. Neil's takedown wasn't brutal in tone, just in logic. When he lays out the numbers, the house of cards folds faster than Starmer backing down from a firm policy position. The best part? This whole plan was designed to look safe, sensible, serious. Labour wasn't going to frighten the horses. They were going to gently lead them to the stable with soothing fiscal lullabies. But as Neil shows, what they've actually done is neuter their own policy agenda to the point of irrelevance. Safety here is just a synonym for surrender. By the end of Neil's analysis, one thing becomes crystal clear. Labour's economic plan is less a roadmap and more a treasure map drawn in crayon, leading to a chest of IOUs. It's not that they made a few mistakes, it's that the entire premise collapses under the mildest pressure, like a vegan souffle made by someone who's never seen an oven. What's staggering is that Labour didn't even need an opponent to collapse. Andrew Neil just read the fine print, quietly, calmly, like a fiscal grim reaper with an Excel spreadsheet.
I've been seeing some reports over the weekend that the government was briefing that this could add 2% to our GDP. Well, in their dreams. It's never going to do that. It's marginal at best. And the argument is not this deal on its own. Is it, where does it lead? Is that the end of it? Is this the end of the reset? Or is this the start of the reset? If it's the end of the reset, then it's marginal. There are some improvements in some areas where the government's made concessions that it shouldn't have done. But in the grand scheme of things, it's quite...
He didn't mock them, didn't shout, didn't grandstand. He just walked through the plan, pointed to the gaps and watched the credibility implode under its own ambition. There's no need for fiery debates or emotional responses when the numbers speak for themselves. When your entire budget depends on imaginary growth, unsourced revenue, magical tax receipts, and the total erasure of Brexit's impact, Andrew Neil doesn't need to destroy you. He just has to notice you, and notice he did. Labour's grand vision was reduced to confetti by the one thing politicians fear more than public scrutiny: math. If Reeves and Starmer truly believe in this plan, they might also believe in unicorns, fiscal fairies, and the concept of winning a budget argument against Andrew Neil. And just when you thought it couldn't get more politely brutal, Labour Neil turns his attention to the illusion of safety, Labour's favourite magic trick. See, when you're scared of backlash, accountability, or doing literally anything concrete, you don't need a plan, you need a vague suggestion of a plan, soft around the edges, slippery in the middle, and evaporates under scrutiny like cheap cologne in a sauna. That's Labour's economic vision in a nutshell. Risk-free, commitment-free, and definitely results-free.
Will welcome the Bank of England's cut in its benchmark interest rate from 4.75% to 4.5%. But it's just about the only good news the bank had for her. It's made a big cut in its forecast for economic growth in 2025 from 1.5% only 3 months ago to a mere 0.75% now. That's bad news for a government which has made growth its primary mission.
Reeves and Starmer seem to think the safest way to win public trust is to build a political IKEA cabinet with no screws. It looks stable until you breathe near it. By trying so hard not to upset anyone, markets, voters, Brussels, Barnsley, they've created a strategy that promises nothing and hopes no one notices. It's not economic planning, it's ghostwriting for a manifesto that never actually arrives. All he needed was a spreadsheet, a few fiscal rules, and the patience of a man who's been waiting 30 years for a politician to understand compound interest. And that's the real burn. Labour didn't even get owned in an argument. They got exposed during a solo performance review. Neil's dismantling was just logic doing yoga, bendy, controlled, and quietly devastating. But hey, the slides had gradients. The fonts were consistent, and if you looked at them from far enough away, they almost resembled a plan. Almost. So, if politics were a bake-off, Labour just turned into a soggy-bottomed soufflé, and Andrew Neil didn't even need to taste it to know it had collapsed. Meanwhile, Andrew Neil will be in his study, sipping tea, quietly wrecking your fiscal dreams one data point at a time.